Hi, I'm Amy, and I'm part of the comms team here at Nautilus International. Before we get started, I just want to flag this video includes discussions of sexual violence and sexual assault, which some viewers might find upsetting. New research from the University of Winchester, commissioned by the charity Safer Waves, is shining a light on the reality of sexual offences at sea. Many seafarers have reported witnessing or even experiencing harassment or assault, but most of the time, these instances are going unreported. To dig deeper into the research uncovered and what needs to change, I spoke with Dr Genevieve Waterhouse, co-author of the report Sexual Offences at Sea, Experiences of Victimisation, Witnessing and Reporting. Here's the full interview.
Can you briefly explain why sexual offences at sea require dedicated research and what makes a seafaring environment so unique in this context?
Yeah, absolutely. So the key reason for this kind of research is that we just have very little information about what is happening at sea in terms of sexual offences. So there has been some research, but it tends to be a bit limited. So either it's kind of looking very specifically at one type of offence, so for example, sexual harassment, or one type of vessel. So, for example, there's been some research around super yachts. And we were really looking to have a kind of broader understanding of what's going on at sea for various types of merchant navy seafarers. And so that was kind of the main emphasis for this research. In terms of why it's important, we know that sexual offences have huge negative impacts for victims, and so that it's kind of a key thing for keeping seafarers safe. And there's kind of more and more emphasis on this, obviously, within the maritime world. And I think that there is a real drive to understand what's happening so that the resources and the support can be put in place, and also interventions to try and prevent these sorts of offences occurring. What's also difficult is that various aspects of the seafaring life mean that actually the ability to obtain support and help is much reduced. It's much harder, and that therefore some of those negative impacts can be even further enhanced because there is less support to kind of try and overcome some of those, try and deal with them and get help with that.
Okay, so this is really quite groundbreaking research then. So what were the key findings?
Sure. So this was a relatively small scale survey. We only had 276 respondents. And it's important to note here that this isn't a prevalence study. So we aren't at all able to say, what we found in our study will definitely be representative of the entire seafaring community. There are aspects that, people who have had experience about sexual offences might be more likely to respond to a survey like this. But the key findings were that certainly these offences are occurring. So in our 276 respondents, 80% said that they had either been the victim or witness of various types of sexual offence. So we included gender discrimination, sexual harassment, and went up to sort of rape and serious sexual offences, including things like coercive and controlling behaviour. So we were looking at a broad range of different types of offence. Gender discrimination and sexual harassment were the most frequently experienced as victim and witness. But we did also find that there were significant numbers of people reporting those rape and serious sexual offences. So we had 49 people say that they had been a victim of sexual assault in the past 5 years, for example, which is, a substantial number of people needing help. Alongside that, we looked at who those victims were. So we found that most of the victims were women, whereas most of the witnesses were men. And then we also looked at reporting behaviours. So we found that the vast majority of victims and witnesses weren't reporting this to anyone, which was slightly surprising because we actually included in our definition of reporting just telling a colleague on board. So, sometimes reporting is seen as like talking to the police, but actually we were including just talking to someone that you knew on board. And so there are clearly lots of people who are experiencing this and not talking to a single person about it. So that's, worrying because they're obviously not getting any support for it. And then finally, those who did report, we looked at what their kind of views of the outcome was. And we found that a very small number were actually feeling satisfied with the outcome for themselves. So again, there's clearly evidence here that there is work to be done, that there's room for improvement in terms of encouraging victims and witnesses to report what's happened, but also in terms of how we respond to those reports and what we do in response to it.
We've known at Nautilus for a while that there are real barriers to reporting sexual assault at sea, and I think that really comes through in your report. So I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
Absolutely. So the barriers, I think, sort of fall within kind of 3 areas. So those are practical, psychological, and professional. So the practical ones can be sort of fairly straightforward, that, like, you know, if you're at sea, you might not have access to the internet, you might not have access to a phone in the same way as you would when you were on land. Or importantly, even if you do have access to those, you might not feel that they're entirely private. And so you might not feel comfortable basically explaining what's happened to you on board while other people can hear. So that's one issue. That another issue is that you might not be willing to report anything to someone who is on board. So you might not have access to people off board and then not want to talk to anyone on board. And there's lots of reasons for that. That can include things about kind of being concerned about not being believed, being concerned about being identified as the difficult one, that it's you rather than the perpetrator that's causing the issue. Also concerns around being re-victimized. And we know that there are kind of power dynamics on board. So the hierarchical structure can also cause difficulties in terms of if the perpetrator is more senior than you are, and then you might have even more concerns about not being taken seriously or being ignored. And then finally, in terms of practical concerns, there's the sort of who actually has responsibility for this. If you want to go to the police, whose jurisdiction is it? We know that there are concerns around flags of convenience, and that can cause multiple difficulties in terms of kind of linguistic differences, cultural differences, and just not feeling comfortable about reporting to a country that you have no real connection to. So those are the kind of practical issues. Then there are psychological issues. So particularly if you're a female victim and you're the only woman on board, that there are concerns around isolation, feeling like you don't have anyone to talk to. And we know that generally sexual offence victims blame themselves for what's happened, and that the process of talking to people can help you kind of identify that what has happened is not your fault. It's not an offence. It's not something that you are responsible for. It's an offence. It's a crime, and therefore help you identify what's happened and therefore reach out for help. So those are the psychological aspects. And then we have more kind of professional ones. So that the living on board is a slightly unique situation, that you are living with people for sometimes long periods of time who are not necessarily the people that you would choose to live with. You know, they're your colleagues rather than your friends and family sometimes. And that therefore there can be concerns about the kind of professional outcomes of reporting, that how it will affect your career, because people kind of are concerned that perhaps if they report, they'll be seen as a tricky person to work with, and that they might not then get the contracts that they would expect to get. And so there's so many different factors which can really act as huge barriers for victims in terms of obtaining help and reporting what's happened to them.
So alongside the issues around reporting, you also mentioned that quite a low level of those surveyed were actually satisfied with the outcome of making a report. So why do you think reporting outcomes are so poor, and what do you think needs to change?
Yeah, so absolutely, we definitely found that. This is kind of important to realise that this is also not unique to seafaring, that reporting generally is quite low with sexual offences, and there's a whole variety of things that are going on around that in terms of kind of concerns about the impact of reporting, how it will be taken in terms of whether they'll be taken seriously. So there's lots of things around that which are aren't specific to the seafaring community. In terms of what is kind of what the issues are, this particular survey is not really able to highlight very much, because we really tried to keep the survey very basic and simple to complete. So it was very much multi-option, multi-choice, rather than filling in kind of actual, sentences in terms of why something's happened or why you felt that way. However, we did provide some various options, and one of those was that no further action had been taken, and that might reflect possibly a lack of policies around what to do when you're having this kind of offence reported to you. It might not be that there's a lack of policies, it might be that there's a lack of understanding around either victims or the policies, and that there may also be things going on around kind of there being support available, but it not being appropriate for seafarers. So another of the options was that there were outcomes that happened after the report, but that they weren't satisfactory. And so that could be that they've been referred to some forms of support, but that those just weren't appropriate, either because they were inaccessible at sea or because they just, the advice wasn't appropriate for being on board. So we can't be sure about what's happening there, but those are possibilities. So in terms of what can be done, that I think an important thing that's come out of this survey is that there needs to be recognition and validation of the fact that this is happening throughout the seafaring community, regardless of whether you are a victim or witness, that you need to be aware of kind of the fact that this is happening and have some understanding of what to do if you're having those kinds of offences reported to you. And also if you see them, like how you might intervene appropriately. So there are kind of community level things that could be introduced and could be supported by maritime organisations, certainly.
So within the maritime industry, as a trade union, what do you think that Nautilus should be doing in our role in supporting our members, including those who have been the victim of sexual assault or sexual harassment?
So as I said, certainly kind of, making it public that you recognise that this is an issue, and that you would support people who have experienced this. Making it clear also that, although the vast majority of seafarers will not be perpetrators, and hopefully the vast majority will not be victims or witnesses, that this is something that all seafarers have responsibility for in terms of ensuring that people feel safe at sea, that they agree on a kind of standard acceptable type of behaviour at sea, how you interact with your colleagues and what is acceptable, and that there is a zero tolerance policy towards this kind of gender discrimination and sexual harassment. Because what we find is that in general with sexual offenders, that offences kind of escalate. So if there's an opportunity to intervene in kind of maybe some slightly more minor inappropriate language, that might kind of reduce that escalation and therefore reduce the perpetration of those more serious sexual offences, because people realise that actually that's not an acceptable way to deal with your colleagues and to interact. So that kind of thing I think is really vital and unions could certainly play a part in.
We're also seeing certain tailored support services come through. So Safer Waves, for example, had a huge role in delivering this survey. So what do you think the role of these support services can be in improving outcomes for victims?
So I think there's a variety of different things that they can provide. So I think it's important to be aware that when people do experience sexual offences as a victim, that there is a real sense of loss of control, that they have had control taken away from them. And so that what we want to do when we're dealing with these victims and trying to support them is give them back the control. So it's not about creating a situation where, they have to report. It's about giving them the option to report. And that can be, obviously, there are kind of, company helplines and things where reporting is certainly encouraged. But Safer Waves, for example, is another option that you can do if you don't want to go via those kind of more formal maritime organisations. So Safer Waves provides a variety of different support, that we have a confidential email service, and that can be for victims who are just looking for some emotional support, just want to talk to someone about it without having to kind of talk to friends and family, or also if they're looking for help in terms of taking legal action, that we can also signpost and help with that process as well. The really key thing about this tailored support is that our volunteers are trained not only in the impacts of sexual offences, but also what it's like to be at sea. A lot of the volunteers do have experience of being at sea, and they're also trained in the kind of limitations and the barriers that can happen because of that kind of lifestyle. And having that combination can really kind of make a difference in terms of the victim feeling heard and feeling understood, and also feeling like they're not alone. That I think a huge part of this is that, you know, it may feel like it's a very small number of people, but actually there are, you know, others who have experienced this, and there are ways of obtaining support and help.
So what resources exist out there for companies who want to respond to these findings and want to ensure that there's a better working environment on board?
Sure. So that Safer Waves have got a variety of different training options that can be implemented. So one of them is an active bystander course. So this is kind of picking up on the idea that this is a community response, and that it's just helping seafarers identify appropriate and inappropriate behaviours and teach them how to intervene in a kind of sensitive and safe way. And as I said, that's kind of to try and intervene early and identify that behaviour is not tolerated, to try and reduce the perpetration. Then the second training that is on offer is about first responders. So this would be for your frontline staff who might actually receive the reports of sexual offences. That lots of research has found that the way that the first report is received and dealt with on a kind of face-to-face basis has a huge impact on how victims then progress with what they decide to do. So if they feel that they're being believed, if they feel that they're being taken seriously, then they're much more likely to obtain help, to also go on to report. And it's also hugely impactful in terms of their well-being. So that training just kind of basically teaches people how to take that report and respond to it in a sensitive manner, and in a useful manner. And then also those are the kind of formal training options, but it is worth being in touch with Safer Waves, because there's also things we can do in terms of presentations to kind of just help staff understand the problem and really raise awareness of the issue within your company. So I would definitely suggest Safer Waves as a first stop for kind of companies who want to address some of these issues.
I suppose my final question would be, if you could deliver one clear message to the maritime community, what would it be?
So I think basically that this isn't something that is just the responsibility of victims and witnesses, that we know that the vast majority of seafarers won't be perpetrators, and hopefully, as I said, most won't be victims and witnesses, but every single person involved in the seafaring community has a responsibility to help ensure that seafarers are safe at sea, and so that everyone has a part to play in terms of ensuring that there is an agreed basic way of an agreed acceptable form of behaviour and interactions with your colleagues on board, and that these sorts of gender discrimination, sexual harassment and more serious offences, it will not be tolerated, and that also, if it is reported, it will be taken seriously, and that's regardless of who the victim is or who the perpetrator is, that really this is a community response that's required to try and shift the culture, so that all these seafarers are safe and feel safe.
Thank you, Genevieve.
Thank you very much.